Wait a second, wait a second. That whole wedding is hers?
Yeah.
Wait a second. What do you're saying, how did I miss this? Wait a second, we may cut this out. You're saying that the entire wedding that was
No, it says
for the
be
other
comforted.
for the king's son. Yeah.
He is the king's son. King Thrushbeard is the king's son.
Wow. I don't even know what to say.
It says,
there. How could I be so dense? Anyway, yeah, we're recording anyway. But no, this idea that there's a spirit behind something. That's why I think the connection back to the water is what powered the mill. He was already engaged in a bargain with the water. And so that makes perfect sense that there's a physical spirit in the story, but that it represents our bargaining with spirits that we do all the time. We just don't notice it.
Yeah. You could have left that conversation with the idea in the back of your mind that, well, it's a good thing that there are no water nixes, right? And the more I thought about it and the more we were talking afterward, it struck me that that's not the right way to look at this, because there may not be some physical manifestation of a spirit, right? And I don't know, whatever you want to call it, but there are spirits of things. And depending on, what viewpoint you're coming from. And I guess ever since that episode, I've even been paying more attention to that. I found myself saying, am I making a bargain with a spirit right now? And it actually frames whatever's sitting in front of you at that moment. It actually frames it a little different. And so one of the examples we said, is social media or your phone. If you don't think there's a spirit of your phone,
holy cow,
that is always bargaining with you to scroll more. What do the kids call it? Doom scrolling?
Scrolling, yeah.
Yeah, so just sit there and doom scroll. Like, if you don't think you're bargaining with a spirit, and again, you don't have to get spooky or whatever, but, if you don't see that, then you're just going to go, oh, I was just wasting time. Part of the points of these fairy tales is to say, no, you're bargaining with the spirit, whether you realize it or not. It may not be this water nix that manifests itself, rises out of the water. I've never seen a spirit rise out of my phone, but it's there. And we bargain with them all the time. I just thought it was interesting, and maybe it was the last thing that went unsaid from that episode that we kind of felt like needed to be said.
Yeah, and just recognize that it's helpful to view it that way. It's like you said, you don't have to be spooky or weird about it, but it's much more helpful to recognize that there are spirits behind things that are constantly calling for your attention. And to your point about the whole doom scrolling, and I've sat there for 30 minutes before, and I'll finally stop, and I'm like, what have you been doing for the past 30 minutes? What a waste of time,
Right.
And I'm watching dumb videos and just running down all these rabbit trails. But it's actually helpful to recognize that and to see that as the spirit of something calling for your attention. And sometimes you win the battle and sometimes you lose. Sometimes you just fall for it. Hook, line, and sinker, right? But yeah, recognize it as a spirit, and it's helpful to see things that way, because then you start to notice them all over the place, and you start to see that pull of the spirits. I don't know, it's kind of like the ancient people, how we sort of say, well, they were unsophisticated people. They believed that there was a God up there in the sun, and they believed that there was a God in that tree, and there's a God of the ocean. And I don't think they looked at it the literal way we look at it, through this materialist scientific lens of an actual being in the ocean. But what they did recognize, that things had spirits and called to you. Things had spirits and could capture you. And we ought to be more aware of that, really. And we're not, because we have this silly notion that the ancients, they attributed gods to everything. And there's a lightning bolt and there's a God getting mad. And, and it's just, it's not a helpful way to see it. You're more susceptible than you realize to it.
Yeah, that's a good way to actually frame it. Is you can define almost the spirit of something is that which is calling you to pay attention to it, and what it's promising you if you will pay attention to it. And we say all this to say, look, there's nothing wrong with looking at your iPhone. Throw in your directions to where you're going, and your iPhone's great, right?
Sure.
If I want to check the baseball score, I pull up my iPhone, it's right there. So that's not what we're talking about. But it's these things that promise, hey, if you pay more attention to me, this will be the payoff. And of course, there's not a payoff, right? Social media, if you want to measure how many friends and how popular you are, you should spend more time on
play the game a little bit.
And play the game, and get the likes and get the friend requests and all that. But you have to step back and really say, is this a silly bargain? We talked about Jephthah in that last episode. Am I making a dumb bargain?
Right.
And I don't know. It actually has helped me, like I said, a couple of times to give it a body. And again, not in a spooky way, but to say, what is calling to me right now? that makes me want to just sit here and doom scroll, or, look at my podcast downloads and measure my self-worth on that, right? Or something like that. Like, what is calling to me? And it's actually just helped me to say, I can see a nix there and I don't want to deal with it right now,
Right. No, it's more helpful to view it as a being, because in a lot of ways it is. Since we don't see it that way, it's merely a phone. It's merely Google. And who can get by without directions from Google Maps, right? We want to put this binary thing of it's either good or bad. And it's not that. It's, I guess a more modern contemporary term would be balance. Have the right balance. Put it in its place. It's fine to obviously use your phone. It's all kinds of advantages of utilizing it. But understand that there's a bargain that's to be made, and it's constantly calling you out to live a life of imbalance. And that's the price you pay.
And we shouldn't go too far down this rabbit hole, because we got another
an episode
to talk about today.
Here. Right.
But gosh, if you don't understand that there are algorithms behind these things that are specifically trying to keep your attention, and if you don't see that algorithm as in some way a spirit, with all the caveats, that's where. But look, that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to hold your attention, and they're making a bargain. And I don't know, it jumped out at me kind of after that episode that I need to pay more attention to this. And maybe the ancients, maybe they're not as, naive and gullible as we think they are. Of course, we've said that through this whole series. That's part of the point of this series. But
no, the more we do this, the more I realize, no, they had it figured out. We're the ones that have leaned too far in one direction, and we're completely blind to the spirits that we come in contact with every day. The point about the algorithm, man, AI is only going to make that worse. Only going to make that more effective. And when people worry about AI, it's not the whole Terminator, Skynet coming online and building robots. I don't think people are talking about that. But I think that wise people are looking at the algorithm saying, if a simple algorithm is gripping people like it's doing in TikTok and some of the social media, what is AI going to do with this? What's going to happen when we inject the steroids into this thing? And
that's right.
And it's something that's worth being at least concerned and aware about.
Yeah, exactly. So, anyway, that was just one of the ending conversations that we had of the last episode after we hit stop. And so we thought, well, let's revisit this a little bit, because it's worth revisiting and just putting out there and paying attention to, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so today, King Thrushbeard, you ready for this one? This is one that you told me about. It's like, dude, you got to read this. This is great. And I read it, and I was like, yeah, this is good, but it seems a little simple maybe. And the more we talked about it, it's deceptively simple. How about that? On the surface, it's kind of like the Red Riding Hood, that if you only look at it as, oh, this is about staying on the path and obeying mom and dad, then you're going to miss all the imagery and details behind it. And this is one of those stories. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one today.
Yeah, and this is our last one too. So it's been a fun journey, but in some ways it's like, oh, we're done. I could just keep doing these. But yes, this is one where the surface reading of it is very simple, and even from some of the things that you and I have seen online, it's actually one that's misunderstood. Because when when you see the pattern of what's happening and what it's actually trying to tell you, I don't know, things just burst off the page to me. And I thought, oh, wow, there is so much here to unpack. But I think as you listen to this, you'll hear it for the first time. I think we told people, like, go read this first. I think this is one you've got to read 2 or 3 times before it starts to click in you, because you do tend to get hung up on, well, this is obvious what this is trying to say. Right. But it's not that obvious.
Right.
So,
yeah. Don't get suckered into the obvious shallow end reading of this story. It's very deep, and there's a lot of things going on, and it's easy to get caught up. Like you said, I think people misunderstand it, but I also think the people that misunderstand it are taking such a simplistic reading of it. Don't you think? I mean, there's so much there. And if you just, I don't know how much I want to talk about it before we read it here.
Yeah.
It's like, maybe we should have this conversation on the other side. And maybe this is where we'll start of what are the problems with the simple reading and the simple understanding of it.
Well, so you run into the same issues with Bible stories sometimes. And look, I've been doing some study, and I was doing some writing yesterday, and there's this one particular story that I revisited, and all of a sudden everything just jumped off the page at me, right? And because I was immersing myself in it. And so I think this is one of those where you have to almost misunderstand it before you can understand it. I don't know. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it does. It's almost better just to get lulled into the story. And it's kind of one of those things where at the end of it, you're like, man, is it about this? Surely it's not about this. I guess it kind of triggers something in your brain to dig a little bit deeper. It's a little bit different phenomenon than some of the previous stories where this really bizarre element of the story pops out and you're like, where did that come from? Where does being turned into a tiger come from, or where does the talking goat come from? And so it almost shocks you to look deeper. This is a little bit different in that it almost lulls you into a simple story. As far as I know, let me think about this. Yeah, there's no talking animals. I mean, all this could literally happen. There's none of this crazy imagery that is impossible. This is more like a parable. It's not this crazy fairy tale land that we're in. This is all could happen, I suppose, And so it just lulls you into the story, and then you kind of deconstruct it on the other end. So yeah, this has that effect on me.
One other thing I'll say, and then we'll jump in and let the listeners listen to it. But this is also one where I think because it's just kind of a plain surface level story, you're kind of lulled into misunderstanding it. But when I started making the links to certain patterns and symbols that we've also seen in other fairy tales, that's where I started to say, okay, if it meant that in this fairy tale over here, then it probably means the same thing here. And so once you start pulling on those threads, I think that's, for me, when this started to make sense. So it's kind of allowing other fairy tales to interpret this in a way as well. Right?
Yeah.
But we'll unpack this on the other side.
I think there's an advantage of this being our last one of this series here. Because if we had started with this, I feel like we would have been trying to explain it. And this happens in other fairy tales, things like that. But I think you're right. I think it's better that we're doing this last because it has kind of a simple surface. Yeah, let's just listen to it and pick this conversation up on the other side.
Yeah, okay. So here's King Thrushbeard.
A king had a daughter who was beautiful beyond all measure, so proud and haughty withal that no suitor was good enough for her. She sent away one after the other and ridiculed them as well. Once the king made a great feast and invited thereto from far and near all the young men likely to marry. They were all marshaled in a row according to their rank and standing. First came the kings, then the grand dukes, then the princes, then the earls, the barons, and the gentry. Then the king's daughter was led through the ranks, but to every one she had some objection to make. One was too fat. The wine cask, she said. Another was too tall. Long and thin, has little in. Some objection to make. The third was too short. Short and thick is never quit. The fourth was too pale as death. The fifth too red, a fighting cock. The sixth was not straight enough, a green log dried behind the stove. So she had something to say against every one, but she made herself especially merry over a good king who stood quite high up in the row, and whose chin had grown a little crooked. Well, she cried and laughed, he has a chin like a thrush's beak. And from that time he got the name of King Thrushbeard. But the old king, when he saw that his daughter did nothing but mock the people and despised all the suitors who were gathered there, was very angry, and swore that she should have for her husband the very first beggar that came to his doors. A few days afterwards, a fiddler came and sang beneath the windows, trying to earn a small alms. When the king heard it, he said it let him up. So the fiddler came in his dirty, ragged clothes and sang before the king and his daughter. And when he had ended, he asked for a trifling gift. The king said, your song has pleased me so well that I will give you my daughter there to wife. The king's daughter shuddered, but the king said, I have taken an oath to give you to the very first beggar man, and I will keep it. All she could say was in vain. The priest was brought, and she had to let herself be wedded to the fiddler on the spot. When that was done, the king said, now it is not proper for you, a beggar woman, to stay any longer in my palace. You must go away with your husband. The beggar man led her out by the hand, and she was obliged to walk away on foot with him. When they came to a large forest, she asked, "To whom does this beautiful forest belong?" "Well, it belongs to King Thrushbeard. If you had married him, it would have been yours." "Ah, unhappy girl that I am, if I had but taken King Thrushbeard." Afterwards, they came to a meadow, and she asked again, "To whom does this beautiful green meadow belong?" "It belongs to King Thrushbeard. If you had taken him, it would have been yours." "Ah, unhappy girl that I am, if I had but taken King Thrushbeard." Then they came to a large town, and she asked again, "To whom does this fine large town belong?" "It belongs to King Thrushbeard. If you had taken him, it would have been yours." "Ah, unhappy girl that I am, if I had but taken King Thrushbeard." "It does not please me," said the fiddler, "to hear you always wishing for another husband. Am I not good enough for you?" At last they came to a very little hut, and she said, "Oh goodness, what a small house! To whom does this miserable, mean hovel belong?" The fiddler answered, "That is my house and yours, where we shall live together." She had to stoop in order to go in at the low door. "Where are the servants?" said the king's daughter. "What servants?" answered the beggar man. "You must yourself do what you wish to have done. Just make a fire at once and set on water to cook my supper. I am quite tired." But the king's daughter knew nothing about lighting fires or cooking, and when the beggar man had to lend a hand himself to get anything done fairly, he did. When they had finished their scanty meal, they went to bed, but he forced her to get up quite early in the morning in order to look after the house. For a few days they lived in this way as well as might be, and came to the end of all their provisions. Then the man said, "Wife, we cannot go on any longer eating and drinking here and earning nothing. You weave baskets." He went out, cut some willows, and brought them to the home. Then she began to weave, but the tough willows wounded her delicate hands. "I see that this will not do," said the man. "You had better spin. Perhaps you can do that better." She sat down and tried to spin, but the hard thread soon cut her soft fingers so that the blood ran down. "See," said the man, "you are fit for no sort of work. I have made a bad bargain with you. Now I will try to make a business with pots and earthenware. You must sit in the marketplace and sell the ware." "Alas," thought she, "if any of the people from my father's kingdom come to the market and see me sitting there selling, how they will mock me." But it was of no use. She had to yield unless she chose to die of hunger. For the first time, she succeeded well, for the people were glad to buy the woman's wares because she was good-looking, and they paid her what she asked. Many even gave her money and left the pots with her as well. So they lived on what she had earned as long as it lasted. Then the husband bought a lot of new crockery. With this, she sat down at the corner of the marketplace and set it out round about her, ready for sale. But suddenly there came a drunken hussar galloping along, and he rode right amongst the pots so that they were all broken into 1,000 bits. She began to weep and did not know what to do for fear. "Alas, what will happen to me?" cried she. "What will my husband say to this?" She ran home and told him of the misfortune. "No one seat herself at the corner of the marketplace with crockery," said the man. "Leave off crying. I see very well that you cannot do any ordinary work. So I have been to our king's palace and have asked whether they cannot find a place for a kitchen maid, and they have promised me to take you. In that way you will get your food for nothing." King's daughter was now a kitchen maid, and had to be at the cook's beck and call and do the dirtiest work. In both her pockets she fastened a little jar, in which she took home her share of the leavings, and upon this they lived. It happened that the wedding of the king's eldest son was to be celebrated. So the poor woman went up and placed herself by the door of the hall to look on. When all the candles were lit, and people, each more beautiful than the other, entered, and all was full of pomp and splendor. She thought of her lot with a sad heart and cursed the pride and haughtiness which had humbled her and brought her to so great poverty. The smell of the delicious dishes which were being taken in and out reached her, and now and then the servants threw her a few morsels of them. These she put in her jars to take home. All at once the king's son entered, clothed in velvet and silk, with gold chains about his neck. And when he saw the beautiful woman standing by the door, he seized her by the hand and would have danced with her, but she refused and shrank with fear, for she saw that it was King Thrushbeard, her suitor, whom she had driven away with scorn. Her struggles were of no avail. He drew her into the hall, but the string by which her pockets were hung broke. The pots fell down, the soup ran out, and the scraps were scattered all about. And when the people saw it, there arose general laughter and derision, and she was so ashamed that she would rather have been 1,000 fathoms below the ground. She sprang to the door and would have run away, but on the stairs a man caught her and brought her back, and when she looked at him, it was King Thrushbeard again. He said to her kindly, "Do not be afraid. I and the fiddler, who has been living with you in that wretched hovel, are one. For love of you, I disguised myself so, and I also was the hussar who rode through your crockery. This was all done to humble your proud spirit and to punish you for insolence with which you mocked me." Then she wept bitterly and said, "I have done great wrong and am not worthy to be your wife." But he said, "Be comforted. The evil days are past. Now we will celebrate at our wedding." Then the maids in waiting came and put on her the most splendid clothing, and her father and his whole court came and wished her happiness in her marriage with King Thrushbeard, and the joy now began in earnest. I wish you and I had been there too.
Okay, there you go. So like we said, this story is deceptively simple on the surface, but it's really dense with themes about pride, transformation, and you might say kind of the painful but redemptive journey toward maturity, right? This episode is going to be a fun ride because, again, it's so easy to kind of get pulled into this. Well, that was unfair. Like, he just tricked her the whole time. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
what's the deal with destroying her pots? Like, she was getting somewhere with that. We're going to get into all that stuff. But maybe the place to start is, at first, this can sound like a simple story of a mean girl who gets what she deserves, right? And
Right, yeah.
When you look online, you were saying that you look on the story, you see a lot of criticism of this fairy tale for being sexist, for being misogynistic. And while I can see where it could be seen that way, I think it's an oversimplified and shallow reading of the story. So maybe the first question for you is, how do you respond to the critics that sort of say this is just a misogynistic narrative of a man putting a woman in her place?
Yeah, and I even saw someone online basically say, maybe this is one of these fairy tales that we should just drop, right? We should just kind of put it to
walk away
bed, put
from
it over there in the corner, just forget about this one because it just really doesn't play well anymore.
Doesn't age well, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we've said before, if something doesn't make sense, you need to dig deeper. And to me, I think a lot of the surface level criticism of, well, this just seems so misogynistic. Well, why did this story last for hundreds and hundreds of years? Why has it been passed down to us, right? There has to be something deeper in there. And so that's where you got to do the work and start digging. Like all fairy tales, if you only see this surface story, and maybe that's because, there are no talking flounders in here, or there aren't any big bad wolves, right? That we tend to take this whole thing too literally. Because maybe if there were, maybe if there were, talking flounders and golden apple trees and things like that, maybe it would allow you to say, okay, let's move past this kind of surface level understanding and really try and understand. But this one doesn't offer that to you, which I think's why it's misunderstood. But you still have to approach it the same way. You still have to go beyond this very simple story, of this bratty princess and this guy who kind of puts her in her place and say, what's the deeper thing this is trying to tell me? And so I think the easiest way is just to start walking through it, because once you start identifying what these different elements mean, then to me, it's almost like the dominoes fall. Like it all starts falling into place.
Right.
And by
Yeah,
the
once
end
you-
of it, you go, okay, this is not about just a guy who's a jerk who's putting some bratty princess in her place.
Right.
It's not about
And
that at all.
yeah, once you understand it, the roles can be reversed and it still have the same impact that it has. You know, this could be a story about a bratty prince and gets tricked by a peasant girl, right? And it still has the same impact that it has.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's just start with breaking it down, and let's start off with, do you want to start with the characters? Do you want to start with Act 1? Because, again, this is one of those stories that kind of comes in 3 acts. So where do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, so let's just start at the beginning, Act 1. And the very first line said, "A king had a daughter who was beautiful beyond measure, but so proud and haughty that no suitor was good enough for her." So that kind of sets the whole stage of what's going to happen. So you have the familiar characters in a fairy tale, right? You have a king who, we've said before, he represents the way things are. So this is interesting to me. One of my notes, and I'll get your take, is, it said he had a daughter who was beautiful beyond measure. Now, we've talked in other fairy tales that beauty actually is a reflection of inner beauty, because not every princess is the most beautiful woman in the world, right? Not every prince is the most handsome prince in the world. But this one actually goes out of its way to say she was very beautiful, but so proud. So it's almost telling you up front, it's like, don't confuse her beauty for her character, which is what you would expect to see in a lot of fairy tales.
Yeah, beauty is a stand-in for the ideal person. And this is clearly, you're right at the beginning, it's talking about this imbalance, that she seems intelligent. She's even witty with some of the jabs that she comes up with about the guys, right? But it's clear that she's emotionally unbalanced. And the other thing is, like, her ridicule of the suitors, it isn't just snobbery. It isn't just that, oh, we got a little rich girl that thinks she's better than everybody else. It's a refusal to connect. It's mockery, right? She mocks everyone, and even the ones who appear to be a worthy match. So at the beginning, it's clearly painting a picture of somebody who's emotionally unbalanced. But she does have this beauty going for her. And like it says, beyond all measure. But again, it's not the ideal inside type of beauty. It's this imbalanced, she's beautiful on the outside, but on the inside, she's a bit of a snob and haughty and, everything that goes along with it.
Yeah. So we kind of got to unpack this first part, and I think that's where things will start to make sense because, again, there's this surface level reading. You go, okay, I get the picture of what's going on here. So one suitor after another was sent away by her. Like you said, she makes fun of them. And then once the king made a great feast and invites from far and near all the young men likely to marry. Now, this is interesting because it says he arranged them according to their rank and standing, right? And first came the kings and grand dukes. And then what you had mentioned is that she goes down this line and she basically not just rejects them, but she mocks them, right? She makes fun of them. And some of them are pretty funny. One was too fat, and she says the wine cask, right? She names him the wine cask.
Right. Okay, so she has her beauty, and she has her status because she's obviously a princess, but she lacks humility. So on the surface, she's emotionally immature, and I think the point is that she's incapable of love. She's not ready for love because love is a mutual acceptance of each other and all that goes along with it. So I think this first section of her mocking everybody, okay, so I think she's kind of a mirror of modern people who have these impossibly high standards, but it's really kind of just a smokescreen to avoid real connections with other people. You know what I'm talking about? She's like the Jerry Seinfeld of the fairy tale world. These crazy high standards, when really behind it, you really see it's just kind of a screen to, I don't want to connect with people, and so it pushes people away. That's the vibe I get from this.
Yeah, that's true. That's funny because it occurred to me, too, at one point, reading through this, that is almost like the Jerry Seinfeld because, every episode, Jerry was dating a different woman, and that became the whole gag, right? Okay, what's this woman going to do that's going to be the one little thing that picks at him, and, then he just dumps her and can't do it anymore, right?
She has man hands. Yeah.
Yes, there's always something. And same thing, like Jerry Seinfeld kind of labeled everything, the low talker or the whatever.
The close talker, right, yeah.
The close talker. Yeah, there was always a reason to reject someone. And you kind of get that same idea here. And the last guy she rejects, it says, this is important because we're introduced to King Thrushbeard. She said, whose chin had grown a little crooked. Well, she cried and laughed. He has a chin like a thrush's beak. And from that time on, he got the name of King Thrushbeard. So she kind of mocks this one guy, and the name sticks, right? So now he's known as King Thrushbeard.
Like all his buddies are calling him this. It's not that she's just taking a shot at him. She's humiliating him in a way that actually sticks with him. It carries out to the rest of his life. It's not just the interaction of them and he leaves and it's like, well, that didn't go well, and so let's not tell anybody about this, right? It sticks with him, and there's something to that.
Yeah. It almost comes to define him. He becomes known as King Thrushbeard from here on out, right?
Yeah.
So there's one thing that I want to point out before we move on, because, there's a couple paragraphs of how mocking she is, things like that. But there's one thing I want to point out, and it's this idea that says the king ordered them all. And you almost it says it actually, they stood in a row according to their rank. And it goes down the, kings and grand dukes and princesses and earls and barons and the gentry. I'm not even sure what the gentry is, but, kings all the way down. So there's a couple things that I want to point out here. We've seen this before. I think it was the fisherman and his wife, and I didn't make the connection at the time.
Right.
But one of the things the wife does is she orders all the people in her kingdom from the tallest to the shortest. She does the same thing. She orders everyone according to their rank, and they you get this picture of they're standing next to her throne, almost forming this big walkway. And it occurred to me that I think, and I'll also say I'm fairly certain, though, that when a fairy tale is talking about this, it's talking about the hierarchy or the way things are ordered in that society.
Right.
So it's not just that he lined them up, right? It's not just that the fisherman's wife said, I want all the tall guys up here and the short guys down there. What that is actually doing is it's telling you that they are somehow ordering the hierarchy, right? They're saying this is the way things are. And that's important in this fairy tale, because this is kind of the first time we're going to go a little deeper here, is you can't see this as her just rejecting a bunch of guys. She's actually rejecting the order of things in her culture that she lives in. She's rejecting the way things are. Right.
Yeah, it took a couple readings for that to sink in, but you're exactly right on that. Because not just this fairy tale, but other fairy tales, it's in Proverbs, it's in the Divine Comedy. What you see is that order matters. And when the king lines up the suitors from greatest to the least, he's invoking a kind of moral or vocational hierarchy. And this is not saying that these people are unequal in value, right? But in the past, social function and the responsibilities that came with it carried a moral weight. That's why in the fairy tales, the king is the embodiment of moral decision-making, of moral, I don't want to say value, because I don't want to say that the king is more important than other people, but it carries a moral weight. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to equivalate the height that on the surface you're like, yeah, okay, the tall guy's in the middle and the short guys, we're going to taper down from that, right?
Yeah.
What they're trying to do is attach a moral weight to everybody. The king's basically laying out a worldview in front of his daughter, right? An ordered presentation of potential unions that reflect how society holds together. Right. And her mocking reaction is essentially her rejecting the created order. That's how this should be seen.
Yes. Yeah, and look, it's easy to see this in today's world, because you're not talking about just someone who says, oh, I don't want to get married. You're talking about someone who's rejecting and mocking the very institution of marriage.
Yes.
Right? That's how you have to see this, what's going on. And I think you're exactly right. Like, the king is ordering things. He's laying out, this is how things are in our society, right? And she's mocking it. She's like, I don't want to even participate in it.
You're right. It's deeper than just merely saying, Dad, I don't want to get married right now. I'm not ready. I'm having a good time with my friends. I want to go to college for, that's not what's going on. It's such a clear presentation of she's rejecting the created order of things. C.S. Lewis talks about this in The Great Divorce. And he says that people create a disconnect between themselves and the world. And that's the Great Divorce. That's where the title comes from. And what she's doing is she's placed herself above the very structure of reality. And obviously the result of this is that she ends up alone. But the Great Divorce is so fantastic. It really does capture this idea of the person who rejects the order of things and says, I don't want to be a part of any of it. And it also has, I don't know if you picked up on this, to go back to one eye, two eye, three eyes, it pulls me back to the cynic, the three eyes, who just rejects everything, who thinks that they see everything, the motives behind everything, and so they're cynical and they reject everything, and they end up just being a critic of everything. Well, this is exactly what she's doing. But you have to understand that what she's doing is she's being critical of the culture. She's being critical of the created order.
Yeah, that's right. And there's no indication, too, that anything is wrong in the kingdom. So when you see that there's a king and he has a kingdom, there's nothing that says he's a tyrant and this was an unjust place, right? So you have to kind of pull that into that as well to see what you were saying is she's rejecting the way things are in a kingdom that's actually functioning. We don't have any reason to believe it's functioning bad at all, right? He seems to be a just king. He's trying to marry his daughter off. And the other thing I would say is I think sometimes it's another reason why we misunderstand this because, there's a modern trope that we project back into medieval Europe maybe, which is this idea that, well, she wants to marry for love, right? Her dad's trying to arrange a marriage and she wants to marry for love.
Right.
My wife and I just finished watching, I think it's called The Empress. It was actually pretty interesting. It's a kind of a true story, as far as I can tell, of, I'm going to forget his name. His name was, I can't remember. Here, let me Google this so I get it right. Okay, yeah. So The Empress, it has to do with the Austrian Empire and the Emperor Franz, right? It's the Emperor Franz and the Empress Elizabeth. Okay, so the story is about how they come together and how they actually rule the Austrian Empire, I think in the 1800s. But it's interesting because the story started out in very much what I had just said, which is that he was actually pledged to be married. His mother arranged this marriage to this aristocratic family. I think it's actually somehow they're related, but the older sister, right? So when the family goes to meet the Emperor Franz and the Queen Mother, that he actually falls in love with the younger sister. So it makes for this awkward weekend, right? Because at the end of the weekend, he says, I've made a decision, I'm going to marry, and everyone gets excited. And then he says, I'm going to marry Elizabeth. And of course, the older sister's devastated. The mother is irate. But it's it's the feel-good story, right? Well, they married for love. And the show is very much about that. I think in real life, they very much at least presented themselves as being in love and devoted to each other. And this was not just another political marriage, right?
Yeah.
So I say all that to say the point is that we love stories like that, right? But this is not one of those stories. This is not a rom-com. A daughter, right? This is not a rom-com where she's like, I want to marry for love and you're forcing these guys on me. Because the other thing you need to see is that when he puts every eligible bachelor in front of her, he's not saying you have to marry this guy. He's actually saying, look around the entire kingdom. Just pick one, right?
Yeah.
And it's this idea of participate in the society.
Yeah.
That's very much what this idea, and her response of mocking it is, just like we've been saying, she's mocking the order of things in that society. And she's basically saying, no, I refuse to participate. Not in a rom-com kind of way of a rebellious, I see myself as better than all this.
Right. Yeah, she sees herself as above it. The lineup of suitors is more than just a wedding procession. It's like a cosmic courtroom, right? And the princess is being asked to enter into the moral order of love, of vocation, of ultimately humility, responsibility, right? And when she refuses to do that, that's when the story kind of shifts to this parable mode and her pride has to be broken so she can see the value in what she once rejected. That's the best framework to understand this story. And it all starts with that lineup of the suitors from tallest to shortest. And so when you understand that, now you can kind of jump in the story and say, okay, now we're going to see that the rest of the story is sort of how her pride is broken so she can rejoin proper society.
Yeah, that's right. It's simply a call to participate in life, right?
Right.
Hey,
life,
participate. Go out there and participate. You could say the same thing about the guy who's 30 years old and plays video games in his parents' basement. It's like, hey, get out there and participate in life.
Yeah.
Go on a date, get a job. It's kind of that same idea. And if you miss that up front, I guess, then that's what leads you to misunderstand the rest of this fairy tale.
Right. I agree. And to go back to the Great Divorce, because this is exactly what he's talking about, is we position ourselves above all of that. It's sort of to go back to the Jerry Seinfeld thing. We pick, we're going to pick out all these little silly things about somebody so that we don't have to make a commitment, right? And that's sort of a joke in a comedy show. But in The Great Divorce, he says we do this in our own minds and we put ourselves above the ordered society and reject it as a way of not having to take any type of responsibility. Again, it's easy to look at it. It's like, well, maybe she, wanted to fall in love. Maybe she wanted to do it a different way. This is about somebody who doesn't want to engage in the cosmic order that says I'm better than that. And all her mockery clearly shows that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so we've established now that this is a picture of her rejecting, basically participating in life in the kingdom. She just rejects it all. So to move the story along then, it says, "But the old king, when he saw that his daughter did nothing but mock the people and despised all the suitors who were gathered together, he was very angry and swore that she should have for her husband the very first beggar that came to his doors." I should tell you where this is all headed, right?
Right. Yeah.
So the king basically says, look, the next beggar that comes to my door, I'm marrying you off. You've rejected everything I put in front of you. This is how that's going to go down, right?
Okay, so yes. Do you think there's something significant to the beggar? Considering everything we just said, she's rejected the normal order of things. So why does her father, because I don't want to overlook this, why do you think her father agrees to give her away to the first beggar? And is there a significance to the fact that it's a beggar?
I think what it is trying to convey is it's this idea of the highest and the lowest. And this is another pattern we've seen. Like last week, the Nix of the Mill Pond, right? The husband gets pulled down to the lowest, right? And so what does the wife do? She has to ascend the mountain. So she has to reach for the highest, right? When things take a different turn, people tend to go in the opposite directions. And so there's this contrast between the highest and the lowest. So what I think this is saying is, I've put all the highest in the land in front of you, and you've rejected it.
Right.
So he's not going to play this game anymore of, now here's the common folks, here's the cobblers. He's just going to almost banish her to the lowest. I think that's what it's trying to say.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Because remember that her father isn't just a dad, he's king, right? He represents the moral order of the kingdom. So it's important to see his pronouncement, not just as like this cruel joke, but as, I guess, like a descent into exile, an intentional, structured descent into exile, right? Into poverty, into this wilderness, where this is where the transformation is going to begin. So her father, the king, again, it's not just the fact that she's his dad, it's the fact that he represents the moral order. So the moral order, if it's rejected, is going to put you into the wilderness. And so that's exactly what happens. So that's what I think the significance of the beggar is. Because it does seem like he doesn't just simply say, well, the next guy who knocks on my gate, I'm going to give her to him. But he specifically says the next beggar. It's like people are going to come and go. That guy doesn't count. I want the beggar. I want the guy who's completely outside of the structure of normal society, somebody that represents exile, and I think that's what the significance of the beggar.
Yeah. And if you play that out even more, so she's rejected kind of normal society. The other thing I'll point out real quick is it says he's the old king. So there is maybe a sense, and we don't have a sense that there's a queen. So there's almost a urgency in the kingdom is about to be handed over to her.
Yeah.
So that's maybe a backdrop too. So there is an urgency to this. And, how concerning would it be as a parent to say, hey, I built this successful business, I'm going to hand it over to you. And the kid just makes fun of it all. Yeah. It's like, well, I'm about to lose everything if this kid doesn't straighten up. So I do think the beggar, it's the edge of society, right? So you've rejected society as a whole. So I'm just going to give you over to the edge of society.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you over to the lowest, right?
Yeah. I think that's what it is. I'm glad you said that about she was in line to be queen, probably, because I didn't really pick up on that, or I didn't think about that. So in sort of the mythic terms, in the fairy tale terms, this is a symbolic death. She loses her name, she loses her title, she loses her comforts, and she even loses like her basic needs, right? And so listen, the king giving her to a beggar is the God move in this story, right? This is the pivot point. And it's important that he's not just punishing her. For a little bit of a spoiler alert, he's not just punishing her, he's staging her salvation. That's what he's preparing her for. And so
actually, that's a great way to put that. Yeah.
Yeah. He's essentially saying that you mocked the man that you needed the most. And so you have to be given over to the least before you understand, before you can rise again and come back into the order of things, right? So she gave up everything. But yeah, he's staging her salvation. That's the big move that's going on with the king.
Yeah, that's a great way to put that, because if you see the backdrop as this is an old king who the kingdom's going to be handed over to his daughter and whoever she marries, and she's rejected every part of the society that the king has actually helped establish, then it's almost like a last-ditch effort to say, then I'm going to cast you out to the wilderness and hope that you see the light and hope that you return transformed. Because at this point, I don't know what else to do, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. I think that's right.
Yeah, and of course, the beggar is not a beggar. It's King Thrushbeard in disguise, right? And of course, that obviously plays out.
Yeah, so it says a fiddler came, and that's the beggar, and we've already heard the story, so we know that it's actually King Thrushbeard. But I was going to ask you, what do you think? Because I'm like, well, a fiddler, that's kind of mean, like, what do you think of the fiddler? It's not just a beggar, it's a fiddler who comes and he's like playing a tune. He's obviously looking for a handout. And the king goes, that's the guy right there. There's your husband, the fiddler. I don't know. Did you think any significant about him being a fiddler?
I didn't, but since you're putting me on the spot, what I'm thinking of is that whole, we talked about this in fairy tales. A song isn't just a song. It's capturing the rhythm of life. It's capturing the rhythm of reality or something. So maybe the fiddler is sort of like a wink at, this isn't just a mere beggar. This is somebody who actually understands the rhythm of reality in the fact that he plays a fiddle. Is there something to that, you think?
Oh, yeah. I think you're onto something. Because you're right, music and song in fairy tales usually represents actually almost a higher level of knowledge.
Yes.
Right? And so I do think there's something to this idea that he's a fiddler. The king even says, your song has pleased me. So it almost, I like the way you said it, it almost is kind of a wink to the idea of there's more to this guy than you realize. He looks like a beggar. He wants a handout. He's in dirty clothes. But this fact that he is able to play some kind of music that pleases the king shows that he actually understands the way the world operates, maybe at a higher level here.
Yeah, aligns with the rhythms of the kingdom, something like that. Yeah. That he knows the melody of the existing system, and that's why it pleases the king.
Yeah. And it's kind of unclear whether the king was in on it or whether he just kind of got this sense of, hey, this is a guy that there's more than meets the eye, right? I said I was going to give away to a beggar, but...
Yeah, I never thought about that. Do you think the king's in on it? I really never even thought that. I mean, I just let the story take me where it goes, but I didn't think about the king being in on it.
I'd have to read it like for the 8th time, but I don't think the story... I think it maybe leaves that unanswered. I think it's one of those things where it's like, well, maybe they had a deal behind the scenes,
Well, look, I don't think I'm giving anything away to say that we're getting into a biblical pattern, or that's what we're implying here, and we'll flesh this out more as we go on. But if we're seeing this as a biblical pattern, and we're seeing, let's just say, the beggar in disguise, and you realize that we're kind of taking this possible gospel angle to this story, then you can start to say, well, okay, the king would be in on it. The king is actually the one who sent the beggar, perhaps.
Right.
To give more away.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to just come out and say it, but it's like, well let's hold off and,
Yeah, we'll unpack that. But yes, if you see the king as kind of basically the deity of this kingdom, then the king is probably aware that this fiddler is more than meets the eye, and maybe it's all prearranged anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
But it doesn't explicitly say any of that. We'll leave it at that, I guess.
Okay.
Well, okay, so to finish what we call Act 1, it is funny because they all fit neatly into 3 acts. The king marries her off and then says, it's not proper for you, a beggar woman. Now, it's interesting because he now addresses his daughter, who's still the princess.
Yeah.
He addresses her now as a beggar woman. And he says, it's not proper for you any longer to stay in my palace. You may just go away with your husband. So that's the casting. I mean, that's harsh.
That's brutal.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
It's like, you're no longer my daughter. You're a beggar woman, and a beggar woman has no place in my palace. So again, it's that almost intentional, if you reject the highest, I'm going to just serve the lowest to you on a silver platter, and you're going to have to embrace it, right?
Yeah, best
Welcome
of luck
to
with that.
The real world, right? Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I kind of see it that way. This is a little bit harsher than that. But yeah, sort of the, hey, man, if you can't pay your rent, you're going to have to get a second job. That's the real world, son.
Yeah, and we can think of examples where you have a trust fund kid who's not doing anything with their life, and the parent finally says, look, I closed your bank account and I've cut off your credit card. And so good luck with that,
Right.
And the kid's like, well, where am I going to sleep tonight? And the parents, I don't know, figure it out.
That's a you problem. Sure.
Yeah, that's right. But there's an attempt behind a storyline like that. There's an attempt to say, I've got to do something to make this kid wake up to reality, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you have to give the king the same benefit of the doubt here.
Yeah. And I think you said a few episodes ago, what is it? Look for the wilderness. You said something about when you read a fairy tale, pay attention to mythic creatures, fantastic
where's
descriptions.
The wilderness? Yeah.
Where's the wilderness? Yeah. You said a few episodes ago, where's the wilderness? Well, here's the wilderness right here. And so if you're looking for that pattern that we see in other fairy tales, this is where the wilderness clearly starts. And, what you were saying is interesting, that recognize that the king is instrumental in sending her out to the wilderness. And again, it sounds harsh. You're like, golly, just making her marry the beggar will turn her around, will wake her up to some degree. But it's like, no, she rejected the order of things. And so therefore she can no longer be a part of the existing order. So yeah, off to the wilderness she goes. And again, this is symbolic of something. And so, so she gets out. Yeah. She gets sent out of the kingdom. And if you understand the symbolism of it, you realize she has to get sent out of the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Because the pattern is so clear in this one, because it says he led her by the hand out and they walked on foot. It said they then came to a large forest. Okay, so there's the wilderness, right?
Okay, yeah.
And then afterwards they came to a meadow. Okay, so that's the transition between the wilderness and the next kingdom. And then it says they came to a large town. So the pattern here is very clear. It's like she has been cast out of her father's kingdom. She has to travel through the wilderness and then slowly enters into another kingdom, right? She goes to a large meadow. That's exactly what this is talking about. And then it comes to another town. So she's in another kingdom now, right?
Yeah.
And that's what these transitions are meant to convey to you. And yeah, I think the reason the father sent her away is it's like, look, you've rejected everything in this kingdom. Try your luck in another kingdom. Well, you've got to traverse the wilderness.
Right. And kingdoms represent the traditional way of thinking. We said this in several episodes, that the kingdom is the existing way of thinking. And if you're going to reject that, well, go find another kingdom. That's the only way it works. And so, this is a clear transition. And the fact that she shows up at a large town is symbolic of her entering into a new way of thinking.
And it should tell you that there is now another king in charge of this kingdom, right? The large town is now, she's in another kingdom, and there is another king in charge now. And so there's going to be a bit of a different reality than the way things were. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's also worth mentioning that as they go into the woods, she asks the question, these are beautiful woods. Who owns this? Oh, King Thrushbeard. This is a beautiful meadow that we're going in. Who owns this? Oh, King Thrushbeard, right?
Yeah.
It's this repetition of, man, if I had only accepted King Thrushbeard, isn't he the one with the crooked nose? Isn't he the one with the beak? Well, it's also funny that I didn't even think about this until right now, is that his response is King Thrushbeard, not his proper kingly name, right?
That's right, which is more of this idea of, so she mocks this guy and gives him the name King Thrushbeard, and that's the identity that sticks with him now. Yeah, so Act 2 is kind of going through the forest, the meadow, the large town, and everywhere they go, she says, who does this belong to? And he says King Thrushbeard. It's almost, what's a good way to say it? It's almost like, that guy that you mocked.
Right.
This is all his.
Yeah, it's like we're going to make fun of Ugly Joe, and then time after time, who owns this castle? Oh, Ugly Joe. Who owns this? All these
Ferrari.
cars. Yeah,
whose Ferrari is that? Well, that's Ugly Joe's.
Ugly Joe.
He wasn't good enough for you.
Yeah, and so
who
at the
owns
end
this
of it,
building?
You have this,
That's Ugly Joe.
Yeah, you have this light bulb moment where she's thinking, "Man, I wish I was with Ugly Joe." And that's I think that's the way you're supposed to see this. You're right. I never even put that together. That's great.
But it also, in talking about it like we just did with Ugly Joe, it also almost shows the shallowness of her.
Yeah,
I made fun of this guy. Like to run with the example, we were kind of saying, whose Ferrari is this? Well, it's Ugly Joe. Well, maybe Joe's not so ugly anymore.
Right.
It's kind of a shallow way to view the world, right?
Yeah. So it's kind of an image that she is adjusting her way of thinking, but it's certainly not deep by any stretch. You know what I'm saying? She's still kind of shallow, but she is starting to turn around and probably regret, golly, well, if Thrushbeard owns all this stuff, I probably should have married Thrushbeard, right? So it indicates the turn, but we're certainly not there yet.
Right, yeah. So then after the large town, she's like, wow, who does this whole town belong to? Well, King Thrushbeard. And after every one, he said, if you had taken him, it would have been yours. Unhappy girl that I am if I had been taking King Thrushbeard, which is funny. And then he finally says, it does not please me to hear you always wishing for another husband. Am I not good enough for you? So he's kind of playing the part, like he's starting to get irritated now. It's like,
right.
Well, look, you rejected him. All this would have been yours, but you're with me now. So they come to a small house, and her response is funny. She goes, oh, goodness, what a small house. To whom does this miserable hovel belong to?
Right.
The fisherman and his wife, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The stinking hovel.
The stinking
and the
hovel.
Answers,
Here we go.
Yeah, of course. It says, that's my house. And he says, and yours, where we will live together.
Yeah, happily ever after. Here we go.
Whose
go ahead and
hovel
settle
is this?
Yep.
And he's like,
Unpack.
It's all yours, baby.
That's right. There's your room back there. You might as well unpack your things there.
Start living the dream.
That's right.
All right, so it is funny.
Well, okay, so as we're talking about this, well, there's no way around it. It's like I want to talk about this story, every detail about how it applies to the end, the big reveal at the end that this is all a gospel story, that this is all a image of being reconciled to God through Jesus, those types of things. So I'm wanting to comment on all these things because all this stuff has more meaning when you see it through that lens. I think maybe it's just the type of thing that where we encourage people to go back and read it through that lens and to see if they pick up on the fact that,
yeah, that's true. But I think that's how we kind of end this, is really tying the gospel.
Yeah. I mean, just the fact that we're chasing after, first we think we're above the natural order of things, that somehow we're the enlightened person, that all that stuff is beneath us, right? And so we reject it. And then you start to turn around. It's like, well, maybe I don't want to reject it completely because I really like this land and I like this forest and I like this town and I like the Ferraris and I like, you know what I mean? And so we kind of engage in it. I don't know. There's just a lot of angles to this when you read it through the end. But like I said, other than being a 4-hour podcast, we'll just have to wrap up with that.
Should we move on to the house? Because this is interesting too, because he gives her 3 tasks. Where, that's the 3 thing again.
Right.
The pattery. Yeah. Okay, so they go into the miserable, mean hovel that's all hers now.
Yeah.
And it's funny because her first response is, where are the servants? What servants, of course? And then I love this. You yourself must do what you wish to have done.
Yeah.
Hey, princess, there are no servants here, right? If you want dinner, you've got to make dinner, right?
Yeah.
So it starts this next pattern of them at the house together. And there's a pattern of 3 that plays out here that's very easy. So he gives her basically 3 tasks to do. And again, spoiler alert, she can't do any of them. She's basically...
Well, let me say this real quick, because this popped in my head when you said that, where are the servants? And he says, well, you have to do it. And this is another thing you can just gloss over and think, haha, this spoiled rich girl thought that there would be servants in this hut. But again, to go back and say, if you reject the order of things, we think we're above these things and we think, oh, I'm not going to fall prey to the whims of society and I'm not going to adjust myself the way society expects me to run. Well, that's fine. But just understand you have to rebuild society. You have to rebuild that order in yourself. Does that make sense? So I see this section where she sort of naively says, wait, where are the servants in this tiny hut, right? Which is absurd. And he says, no, you have to, if you want it, you have to build it, which is a way of saying when you reject the order of things, don't think that you're just merely rejecting it and walking away and saying, no, I don't want to be a part of that. You have to build something yourself. You got to start from scratch. And you have no idea how fundamental the things that you have to start building are when you reject the world the way it is.
Yeah, that's actually a good way to put this. She has to start over, and anything she wants, she has to do herself. For some reason, while you were talking, the image I had is the college kid know-it-all who's denouncing all the evils of capitalism while they have their venti Starbucks and their iPhone, right?
Right.
And it's like, no. If we're going to play this out, you might as well hand those over to me.
Yeah.
And give me the keys to your Tesla also. It's
or
you're going to have to...
The idealistic person that says, make love, not war, we shouldn't be in war and we're killing babies. Why are we doing this? It's like, okay, I understand that. Let's start from the very beginning. How do you untangle the mess between Russia and Ukraine or Israel and Gaza, right? You tell me, oh wise one. Where do we start?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like you can say these things in an idealistic way without realizing that you're undoing everything and you have to start from the very foundation foundation of something and rebuild it. And I think that's kind of what that line, that's at least what that line tells me, right?
No, that's good. And it actually plays into, I think, the tasks that he gives her.
Right.
Because
yeah.
Right, because the first thing he does, like the next day, is he went out and cut some willows and he brought them home. And then he says, you're going to have to earn your keep around here. So here's some willows. I need you to weave baskets. Right? She begins to weave, but the tough willows wounded her delicate hands.
Right.
Now, it's funny because he says, look, you can at least make baskets, right? And I think we kind of joke that sometimes in college, what's the football player major in? And we say, well, basket weaving. I don't know.
Right.
We used to say that. It's kind of a way, it's like, what's the easiest major for the dumbest guy on the team to be able to pass? And, it's basket weaving, right? So
basket
this is the
weaving,
simplest of tasks, right?
Right. No, that's great.
And it says the willows wounded her delicate hands, so she can't weave baskets.
Yeah.
And then it says he gives her thread, and then the same thing, the thread cut her soft fingers so that blood ran down. So I want to point out here that like this idea of weaving and sewing, you tie this back to some of the other images that we've looked at in fairy tales. It's much more than just a menial task. It's actually, sewing is a way, I think we talked about this last episode. So, with the spinning wheel. Sewing is a way to say that she understands her proper role as a, what did we say? As a defender of the household and a provider for the children.
Right.
Right? Because we referenced the idea of Penelope in the Odyssey, weaving her tapestry.
Right.
So that imagery is attached to this. So he's not just giving her menial task, like in the story, that's what he's doing, but he's also basically saying, can you at least at the most basic level function as a provider in this house, a protector of future children? And she can't do it, right?
Right. Yeah. She's completely unequipped for reality.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And to your point about the spinning, spinning is a way to view that is not just simply, well, that's a woman's job, so get in there and do it, right? What it is taking chaotic, disconnected fibers and weaving them into a useful thread that can weave and make something, right? And so, again, it's going down to the foundation of something. If you're going to reject the current order, well, you've got to go back down to the foundation. You better learn how to weave. You better learn how to take these dispersed fibers and make something functional out of them, or else all you're doing is just naively rejecting something. If you can't start and build something new and explain how we're going to start from the beginning, how we're going to tear this down to the foundation and rebuild, well, that's what the spinning represents. And it, obviously, on the surface level, again, her fragile hands, her delicate fingers are ill-equipped, which is, again, another great image of somebody who foolishly rejects the created order, not realizing that you're completely unequipped to rebuild from scratch.
Yeah, that's right.
You're completely lost without the order. And so I like your idea about the college student sitting there with his venti macchiato, It's like, you have no idea how unequipped you are to actually set order to things and how difficult it is. So you just sit back and mock the existing system.
Yeah, that's right. If you want your coffee tomorrow and you're going to reject the whole order, here's a coffee plant.
Yeah.
How in the world do you make coffee out of this thing, out of the beans and the berries on there and all that? It's like, yeah, that's right. Giving them all the raw material and say, well, here you go. Start rebuilding your perfect society then, right?
Have at it.
Build your
in 4
utopia.
years. Yeah. 4 years prove me wrong that you got some little drip coffee thing going, right?
All right. So she can't do the willows. She can't do the thread. So he finally says, now I will try to make a business with pots and earthenware. You must sit in the market and sell the ware. Now, I think there's something interesting here, too, because he specifically points out earthenware, which is like, that's the lowest, right?
Right.
He's not saying make gold jewelry. He's basically saying, look, you can't screw up dirt. When you were a kid, right? When you were a kid and went to summer camp, you plop a lump of clay in front of a kid and you make your dad an ashtray, even though it doesn't smoke, right? But that's what you do because any kid can make that, right?
Right.
And
Anybody
to
can
me,
take
that's
mud and surely make a bowl, right?
Yeah, that's right. So to me, this is what it's like, okay, you can't screw this up, right? Here's some earthenware.
Yeah.
Try not to mess this up. To me, it's another funny image.
Yeah, but the thing not to miss is that she didn't make it. It's somebody else is making this simple pot.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
And so it's important to realize she fails at making or creating anything, which is interesting because it implies that she doesn't really have any functional talents, right? She doesn't offer anyone any value. Give me something that you can do. And we're saying this obviously in a cynical way, but we talked about this when we talked about fruits of the Spirit. I forget the episode, but it's several episodes back. And one thing I'd said that I mentioned is that what value is fruit to a tree? Like, what value is a lemon to the lemon tree? And the answer to that is nothing. You can have a healthy fruit tree that doesn't bear any fruit. Like, it can be biologically healthy is what I mean. It's not functionally healthy. So in a biological way, yes, a tree can be completely healthy but not bear any fruit or give you sour fruit or inedible fruit. It doesn't care, right? The tree doesn't care. The point of fruit in the Bible is that it's meant to communicate value to others, right? Value to the community, value to people around you, not necessarily to yourself, right? So, I mean, this idea that she's unequipped for anything, she doesn't offer anyone value, but the one thing she put value in was her status, her title, her good looks, right? And she never thought to think, I mean, again, you're going to be queen, right? You're going to be ruling over a nation and your decisions are going to affect other people, but yet she had nothing to offer other people. And that's what I think it's trying to say with the fact that she couldn't spin, she couldn't weave baskets, and so she has to take other people's creations and go out and sell that, right? That's kind of where I see this.
No, yeah, that's good. And again, it's just that picture of the three eyes, right? It's three eyes again, right? It's the person who sits on top of the world, criticizes everything going on in the world, and yet has nothing constructive to offer society.
Right.
Right. That's the picture that's being painted here.
Yeah.
So it's important to see that because, again, we can fall back into the like, man, this guy is just being mean to her. It's like, no, he's doing whatever it takes to pull anything of value out of this princess who at least the potential lies there for her to be ruling the next kingdom now because she's in another kingdom, right?
Yeah.
Pull anything of value out of her.
And he's setting up
do it.
Yeah, and he's setting up the scenario for her to see that she has nothing to offer. And that's another it's just an important thing to note when we get to the end and tie all this together. That, he's pointing out and giving her the opportunity to say, what do you have to offer me? What do you have to offer society? What do you have to offer the world? And her answer is basically nothing. And so she has to go in and sell somebody else's pots, right? Okay, so this is an interesting section because this is where I kind of had a problem with it. Remember, the surface reading, I'm thinking, okay, she goes out and she sells pots, and she's actually, for the first time, she's kind of successful doing something, right? She's selling these pots, right? And then, of course, a horseman, who turns out to be Thrushbeard, goes barreling through and destroys all the pots. And I remember that bothering me, thinking, well, come on, man. She's actually being helpful. She's finally bringing in some money, right? But then he destroys that. So, what's your deeper take of that?
Yeah, okay. So I read this section a couple of times, and I'm going to offer a little bit of a spicy take, okay?
Okay.
Because, again, it bothered me the first time, too. I'm like, well, she was finally succeeding, and then he just, destroys all the pots. It's like
undercuts her and
malicious.
Yeah, right, yes.
Right. Okay, so I had this idea. I had this picture, and we'll keep this PG-13, but there's this idea of selling your wares in the marketplace that could be taken as basically she has began selling herself. Right?
Yeah.
Now, we have to unpack this, and I have to make the caveat that I'm not saying that's what she was doing in this story. What I'm saying is the way the story is written, I believe that that's what it might be alluding to.
Well,
I don't know.
yes.
Does that make sense? It's like on the surface, it's like, no, you're not supposed to see that she's prostituting herself.
Right.
But the deeper level is definitely, I think, insinuating that that imagery, that theme is what's behind all this.
Right. Well, it says in the story, it says, for the first time she succeeded well, for the people were glad to buy the woman's wares because she was good looking, and they paid her what she asked. Many even gave her money and left the pots with her as well, right? So it is kind of this sort of implication that at the very least, she may not be literally prostituting herself as far as the story goes, but at the very least, what she's doing is she's going back to her she's still not offering anybody any value except to look at her. Come take a look at me. Come talk. You know what I'm saying, right?
So it is. Yeah, no, exactly. So it starts out by saying that she was, what did it say? She was one of the most beautiful. She was beautiful beyond measure, right?
Right.
But there's nothing of value within her. So it is interesting that the first time she starts succeeding, it says, like you just read, people were glad to buy the woman's wares because she was good looking.
Right.
And it's like, it's almost like there she's falling back again on that very shallow level. It's gosh, I mean, it's like she started an OnlyFans account and go, hey, I'm starting to make some money here. And it's like, no, that's not what you offer the world, right?
Yes, that's brilliant. I love that. Yes, she's
And
using
so there's
her good
that.
looks once again, leveraging her good looks, leveraging the shallow end of the pool once again. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly what she's doing.
Yeah, exactly. And then the next line that you just read, many even gave her money and left the pots with her. So it's like, gosh, I mean, once I saw the illusion here, it's like I can't unsee it now, right?
Right.
It's like, so now people are paying her and they're not even taking pots. Well, it's kind of like, well, what are they paying her for then?
Right.
And
Yeah.
again, she's got a little OnlyFans account behind the scenes here. And she's like, hey, it's starting to work. I'm making some money. And it's like, no, that's not what you offer society.
Right. I'm not doing anything
back on
wrong.
the same thing.
Yeah. There's definitely those implications. Again, I think you're dead on with that. You're right. It may not be a literal, that's what she's doing. I think you're saying that it's not necessarily a euphemism, that selling her pots is a euphemism for prostituting herself. But it's definitely pulling on that thread of saying, look, she's still not offering anybody anything. All she's doing is sitting there and being good looking and thinking, I can leverage this. And look, I even have the pots left over. We can still sell the pots and I still have money, right? And it's just such a, I don't know, it's just such a kind of gross on both ends. The men that are coming to give her money just to look at her and not buy her pots, and on her end too. So the whole thing's gross. You're right.
Well, yeah, not to go down this road too much, but imagine this wife coming home and's like, hey, I made $100 today. Oh, did you sell pots? No, they didn't even want pots. And you'd be like, wait a minute, what's going on in the marketplace?
Right.
I think I want to accompany you tomorrow and see what's happening.
Yeah, some of the men just rubbed my shoulders and left. And you're like, okay, I don't like this at all. This is freaking creepy.
Yes, but that picture, that image, and OnlyFans, I actually think is a great picture of that. It's like, I'm not doing anything wrong. So it actually explains then why King Thrushbeard, why the writer comes through and destroys the pots. If you see this as an allusion to something a little more seedy, then it actually explains why he does that. As otherwise, it's kind of a jerk move, right? Hey, my wife was just starting to be successful and I'm not done teaching her a lesson, so I'm going to go destroy her work.
Yeah, I'm going to sabotage it.
Yeah.
But the better way to look at it is, no, she's not selling the pot. She's selling herself. And that's that's not acceptable. I mean, you're a wife, all that kind of thing. It's like, yeah, that's not the way to do this. And so he's basically undoing the nonsense that she thinks she's succeeding at.
Yeah, that's right. And another subtle clue, and I may be reading too much into this, but it says with this, she sat down at the corner of the marketplace. And then the husband actually gets onto her saying, it's basically, what were you doing at the corner? And I thought, well, that's weird.
Yeah.
But if you understand this idea of the center and the fringe again, right?
Yep.
And you understand the illusion, what's going on here. The illusion is she's not at the center of the marketplace with all the other vendors. She's kind of off to the side.
Yep.
Like something, I think it's just another subtle illusion that something shady is going on here.
Well, all you have to do is say, standing on the street corner. Well, what does that mean? Everybody knows what that implies, right? And I just think it's interesting that this ancient story, or this certainly old story, kind of implies the same thing. Yeah, again, it's one of those things, don't miss that detail. What were you doing on the corner? It's like, well, where am I supposed to be? And again, if you look at it on the surface, you're like, well, I guess the corner is probably more dangerous because traffic's coming through and you're more likely to break the pots. But no, it is a definite allusion to, what are you standing on the street corner for? What do you think you're going to achieve? Why are you selling yourself on the street corner? I mean, that's just a perfect, I don't know, that just fits in perfectly with that idea.
Yeah, it actually does. That's a very good modern phrase that we would use, and everyone knows what you're talking about. Hey, I got you a booth in the center of the town square, and you told me that your display got messed up on the street corner. It's like, what were you doing on the street corner? I had you a booth in the middle of town,
Right. Okay. Yeah, I like that too. You're right.
And so that helps make sense of all this. Now the actions make sense. He's the one who rides through town and tramples the pots, right? Because he's like, this is not the path you need to be going down.
Right. Yeah. And this is where we've made mention of this, but this is where I became pretty convinced that this is clearly meant to reflect some sort of gospel story, right? Because again, to go back to the beginning, why would he want to undo what little progress she's finally achieving? It's not because he wanted to take her down a notch. It's because she's still relying on something other than her character, right? In a way, she's trying to charm her way toward virtue or something like that. She's shortcutting righteousness is what she's doing. And the moral here is that you can't bypass the wilderness. You can't shortcut righteousness. You can't shortcut the process of salvation or something like that. Anyway, this is where I started to really say, okay, this doesn't make any sense unless you see this as a redemptive gospel type story.
Yeah, and we'll unpack this at the end, but yeah, since you brought it up, for it to be a story of really divine redemption, then you really do have to see the character as being in the lowest place.
Yes. Right.
So it doesn't do any good to redeem her if she's really good at making baskets and now they got a nice little living going on. Like, she literally has to be in the lowest spot if this is going to be the idyllic story of redemption.
Yeah.
She has to be pulled off the street corner. She has to be pulled out of the gutter.
Yeah.
That's the way to look at this.
Exactly.
Okay.
I keep jumping ahead. It's killing me.
I know. We'll get there. Well, let's finish the story and then we can really unpack this.
Okay.
Because as a result of this disaster in the marketplace, he says, I finally found you a place in the king's palace, as a kitchen maid. So basically, you're worthless to me here in this house. You might as well go work. Again, it's the lowliest of lows, right? In fact, it says the king's daughter was now a kitchen maid and had to be at the cook's beck and call and to do the dirtiest work. So there's this idea of the lowest again, right?
Yeah. But if you look at the scene, she's rejoined the order of things. She's in the palace. Granted, she's cleaning toilets and stuff like that, but I'm saying that it's an indication that the turn is continuing. At first, she was just like, who owns all this wonderful stuff? Oh man, I really should have married Thrushbeard. Well, that's an indication of regret maybe, but the character hasn't changed. And so now she goes through, do you have anything to offer the society? Do you have anything to offer the community? No. Well, I can sell myself a little bit, and we're going to undo that because that doesn't build character, right? That's going the wrong direction. Yeah. And so now at least we're in the palace. So it should be a little bit of a message of this is the entry point back into society maybe, or back into the order of things.
Yeah, and I think that's why I was trying to think. That's why I think she's at least back in the king's palace. Now, it's a different kingdom,
right?
But at least she's back participating, even at the lowliest of jobs.
Right.
She's at least back participating in the order and structure of a society, even if she's starting at the lowest rung. Yeah,
right.
That's the way to see this.
Yes.
That's right.
Okay, so she's sweeping, she's doing menial tasks at this new castle, this new palace, and then we have the banquet scene. Okay, so then what we find out is that there's been this big banquet, and she is ordered to be a servant to all the people that she rejected at the beginning of the story, right?
That's right. It's a circle back around to the original scene.
Yeah. So in a way, she's in her former life, but obviously not with her former title, right? So her identity's been stripped, and now she's kind of this object of scorn because of this banquet scene.
Yeah, and it's actually a wedding of the king's eldest son. So it's almost like she now enters into, play off of what you just said, it's almost like she now enters into the very scene that we started with that could have been hers, right?
Yes.
Only now she's looking at it enviously.
Yeah,
right?
from the outside.
She's looking at the celebration. She's looking at the candles, the food. And it's like this all could have been her from the beginning, but she rejected it all, right?
Right.
So then comes the next setup, basically. So all at once the king's son entered, clothed in velvet and silk and gold chains around his neck. And when he saw the beautiful woman standing at the door, the servant, he seized her by the hand and would have danced with her, but she refused and shrank back with fear. So that's interesting because she again rejects the social order of things, but now it's out of a sense of humility. I didn't pick that up the first time, but when I just
I didn't either. Yeah, it's almost like she was willing to sell her good looks to sell pots, but when that went south, maybe this is sort of an indication that, look, I'm just a chambermaid, right? And here this royalty, this royal person sees how beautiful I am and grabs my arm and says he wants to dance with me, but I'm not making that same mistake again. It's an awareness move, don't you think? I mean, I think this is sort of some kind of awareness. I'm not going to fall into this trap again where I rely on my good looks to provide something of little worth to people, right?
Yeah, and maybe at this point she doesn't even see herself having any value, right?
Well, okay, that's another way to look at it. Yeah, maybe that's a better way to look at it. She doesn't even recognize her own beauty anymore.
Right. For the first time, it's like, no, this would be a social faux pas for you, the king's son, to dance with someone like me. I'm just a lowly kitchen maid. It's like for the first time, gosh, we'll have to wrap this up because I keep wanting to caveat what you say. Like, this is a gospel message. For the first time, she actually is seeing herself through a bit of realism, maybe.
Right. Yeah, she's seeing the real her, maybe. And she's humbled by it. Not humiliated. Well, she's about to be humiliated, but she's humbled by it.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Okay.
So the struggle, well, it says her struggles were of no avail. So it's like the struggle is he's pulling her onto the floor to dance, and she's refusing to go. And the story kind of talks about how she had some pots tied to her apron because she kind of, she scraped off the food, and that's what she's going to eat later tonight.
Yeah.
So in any case, in this kind of, he's pulling her on the dance floor. She didn't want to go. Her apron breaks, and these pots break all over the place. Well, now she's mortified because now she's the objects of scorn, right?
Right.
Everyone's
Everybody
laughing
realizes
at her.
that she was trying to steal food and how pathetic that is, right? And I think right now she kind of, I don't know, maybe the scales have fallen off her eyes at this point, because somebody could look at something like that and you could see yourself as a victim, right? You could be in that situation and be mortified, but you see yourself as a victim. And I don't think that's what's happening. I think she's seeing herself as someone who used to look down on other people like herself, except she knows I'm in that position now. So finally, the table's been completely turned, and I think she's realizing it. And so she starts to weep, not just from shame, but from awakening, maybe, is kind of what I read into this part right here.
Yeah. Maybe for the first time, a sober perspective on who I really am.
Right.
Get past the good looks. Yeah, I really don't have anything to offer.
Yeah, however you look at this is bottom, right? Everybody has to find bottom. This is the prodigal son eating the pig food in the pig trough and realizing, what am I doing?
Exactly.
And she's going through that same thing, right?
All right, so then it's the big reveal. We can finish this story up, then we'll talk about it. The big reveal is she runs to the stairs. The man caught her and brought her back in, and then he reveals, "Do not be afraid. I and the fiddler who have been living with you in that wretched hovel are one." So he says, "It's me, King Thrushbeard." And he goes through and says, "For love, I disguised, I destroyed your pots," right? But he makes it clear that this was all done, well, it actually says, "This was all done to humble your proud spirit and to punish you for the insolence with which you mocked me." Now that kind of sounds a little harsh as well.
Uppity.
But she says, "I've done a great wrong. I'm not worthy to be your wife." But he says, "Be comforted. The days of evil are past. We will now celebrate our wedding."
Right.
And so that's the big thing. The whole wedding is hers, and she's going to marry King Thrushbeard.
Wait a second. That whole wedding is hers?
Yeah.
When you said that, I'm sitting there thinking, oh, wow, wait a second. The whole wedding, that was set up for, I knew it was set up for her, again, I don't want to say humiliation, for her humbling. That's fine. But no, it just never clicked to me that the entire thing was set up for her wedding.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Anyway, I'm just going to play dumb and keep moving.
Okay, but it says, "Be comforted, the evil days are past. Now we will celebrate our wedding." And then it said the maids in waiting came in and they put on splendid clothing. And her father and his whole court. So I guess that's the answer. Her father and his whole court came.
Okay, yeah. So that I guess that goes back to did the king know about it? And so whether he knew at the beginning, I don't know, but he certainly was let in on the whole deal. Right. Okay.
Yeah, but the wedding that she's at is her wedding.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. How about that? All right. Just for some reason in my own memory of the story, it was like they then got married, but I guess I just skipped the part.
That's how it usually works.
Yeah, the happily ever after, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, okay.
Well, let me read the last line. So the last line in fairy tales are usually great, right? A lot of times you go, yeah, that's a great way. So the last line is, they got married and the joy now began in earnest. And the last line is, "I wish you and I had been there too."
Yeah.
I just think it's a great,
it's something, if you said, how does a fairy tale end? Everybody says happily ever after. And then you read a bunch of fairy tales, and I'm sure some of them end that way, but most of them don't end that way. And there's some kind of little twist on it. But you're right. That's a great line. I wish you and I had been there too.
Yeah. I think another one said, "You need not ask if they were happy," or something like that. Or they're still fighting to this day, right? In the novel.
Right.
There's always some great way to end each fairy tale. But that's a great line to end this one.
No, that's great. Well, did they change or did they not? And this is clearly one of those lines that sort of says, yes, there was a transformation And that's where the happily ever after part comes from.
Yeah.
The transformation is now made permanent.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so let's bring this full circle because we can finally start talking about that this is a story of the gospel. This is a story of God sending his son to redeem the world and save it.
Right.
And I think it's so clear. I think it's so clear once you get that image in your head. So what are some of the things that jumped out at you that said, this is the right track here, this is the right way to read this?
Well, again, when he destroyed the pots, that was the first time I just, I had to go back to that point thinking, what in the world? Why would he undo all the, she seemed like she was getting some traction in life, right? And he undoes it. But then when you see it through a gospel lens, and again, you see that she's relying on something of herself, not anything she can offer anybody, but something, just like I said, her good looks. She's offering herself to other people for money, right? Then you can really kind of say, okay, this is that idea that I don't have anything to offer. The whole, I can't spin, I can't weave baskets. But every once in a while, we have that idea that, well, I do have this going for me. You know what I mean? And to tie it to the gospel message, it's that point in our lives where we sort of say, oh, yeah, I'm a filthy beggar. I am a terrible person. You kind of belittle yourself. But then in the way you live, you sort of say, yeah, but I am a pretty good conversationalist. I am pretty good looking, or I really do make people feel good. You know what I mean? It's that whole idea of wanting to go back and say, I do bring something to the table. And what this story is telling you, once you see it through the gospel lens, is no. There's nothing you're bringing to the table to God. There's nothing that God says, man, what would I do without you there, right? And that's just a clear image of that. So anyway, where he destroyed the pots is where it really kind of, hit home for me that that's what this is about.
Yeah, that's what did it for me too, is the marketplace. Because, man, once you see that image, there's so many biblical parallels. You already brought up the idea of the prodigal son, right? Here's the kid eating the scraps that the pigs leave, right?
Right.
And the father says, you're welcome in my house, right? Not only just to be a servant, but to come back and be my son, right? It's the story of redemption. Man, all throughout the Old Testament, when Israel turns to other gods, how do the prophets or how does God refer to them? He refers to them as prostitutes.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
I mean, he says, you prostituted yourself to other gods. And yet then we see God going to great lengths to bring them back, right? So it's a theme all throughout Scripture, right? We are unfaithful to God, and yet God will go to great lengths to bring us back into a right relationship with him.
Right.
One
to
other thing I
restore the
want to point out
relationship.
is, because you said, we have nothing to offer, and there's truth to that. And yet we still have the potential. God sees in us the potential to become almost like God. God sees the potential. We talked about this idea of theosis on some other episodes a long time ago. But God at least sees the potential in us to be this son or this daughter that he loves. And he sees all the potential in the world. So I think that's important to point out too. And you see it in this story where it's like she marries King Thrushbeard and she didn't have anything to offer, but she always held out the potential of being the queen of her kingdom. And there's no reason to think that didn't happen, right?
Yeah.
Only now
Underneath
she
it all
knows
is the
properly
queen.
handle it.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I think that's another important thing to point out, that it's not just that she was worthless and had nothing to offer. She always held this potential of being a ruler of her kingdom. Right.
Well, and that's our situation. In one sense, the Bible describes us as filthy rags, and in another sense, it describes us as sons and daughters of the Most High God, right? And so it's this dichotomy that seems impossible. You're like, well, look, which am I, right? But it's the tension between those two ideas, right? And in myself, I'm nothing, but when you add King Thrushbeard, right? Now you rise, right? When you add the redemption of Christ, now you rise to be the son and daughter of the Most High. That's how you achieve that, not through your own difficult work or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And so, there's a lot more to it than that. But you're right, it's such a clear picture at that point. And another story in the Bible that so clearly parallels King Thrushbeard is the prophet Hosea, right? And he's told to marry a prostitute, and then she leaves him and sleeps with other men and has kids with other men, and then he goes and redeems her, right? I read Hosea this morning, actually, and it's interesting. I didn't realize in the story of Hosea that he actually secretly bought her back. The idea is that he married the prostitute, she left him, she goes back into prostitution. There's implications of a lot of these things, that she goes back into prostitution, gets sold as a slave once again, and that he bought her back. He redeemed her, but he did it in secret, which is interesting because I was sitting there thinking the King Thrushbeard story, and I'm like, yeah, he did all that in secret.
He's in disguise, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
And so there's a lot of parallels between Hosea and this story. In fact, to the point that I don't think the writer of this story could have not been thinking about the book of Hosea, kind of trying to tell a similar story,
Yeah, and you could see from that perspective, maybe it's like, how do I tell this story to kids? So instead of her being a prostitute, she's selling earthenware at the corner of the marketplace. And yeah, I could see that.
Sure.
I think you're right. I think the parallels are so clear. And of course, Hosea marrying the prostitute is a picture of God redeeming Israel.
Right.
It goes back to that thing about you prostituted yourself to other idols. And so what God is doing in that story is he's saying to Hosea, unfortunately, Hosea is the one who got tagged with this task, but he's saying, in order to demonstrate this and bring Israel's sin before their eyes, I'm going to have you do this shocking thing.
Right. Yeah.
And so from that standpoint, you can see that, the story of Hosea, it's kind of this small pattern of the larger pattern.
Right.
And the prodigal son is also a small pattern of the larger pattern, right? And there's so many stories, I think, in the Bible that you could pick out of the small pattern that is emblematic of the larger pattern. And yeah, I think you're right. I can't read this story now and not see this as a small pattern of the larger pattern of redemption.
Yeah. And the funny thing is that the book of Hosea is also kind of, if you read it on the surface, that's another kind of misogynistic, sexist. You can read the sexist overtones into that story, right? And to go back to the original critique of this is that, it's outdated. This is clearly sexist or whatever. But, if this story is misogynistic, then so is the gospel, right? And that may sound provocative, but if you think about it, the gospel is about a wayward bride. That's the way it describes us, right? And that's humanity, who has to be humbled to be saved. And the groom, Christ, allows us to fall in order to lift us up, right? And the love of the bridegroom looks like loss before this glorious wedding at the end, right? And so I guess I'm saying if King Thrushbeard is merely a cruel man humiliating a woman, then Hosea is about a controlling God forcing submission, right? But if you read Hosea and the fairy tale as stories of just insane mercy, then they're not about humiliation. They're about healing through humility, not humiliation. And there's a difference between those two.
Yeah. And to kind of hammer that point home, why is this not misogynistic? Well, it's because if you don't see yourself as the princess who mocks reality and rejects God, then you miss the whole point of the story.
Right.
So to bring it home then, if I don't see myself as that entitled, spoiled princess, then I miss the point of the story.
Again,
and
you can flip the gender roles and it still works.
Yeah.
And that's an indication that this isn't merely a sexist story.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I was just saying, any last thoughts?
Well, okay, what pops in my head is that fairy tales at their best and myths at their best and parables at their best, they don't just tell us how the world is, they show us how the soul works. You know what I mean? And that's this story. It's far from being some kind of patriarchal lesson, right? It's about how we are all the proud princesses, regardless of whether you're a guy or a girl, right? We're this haughty princess that thinks we have this title and thinks we have something to offer, and we're cynical and we reject society and the order of things because we think we can do it on our own, only to find out that we're not equipped to engage in the world outside of the realistic reality structure that the Bible lays out, right? And you can't get away from that. And if you try to get away from that, well, there you go. That's the wilderness. And some people would say that's hell. And so it's only through loss. It's only through this descent. It's only through being taken down that you can become capable of, you can say that's the way you become capable of love, but certainly the love of God, the love of Christ, that's how that works. You have to be taken down. You have to have all that stripped away before we're capable of doing that.
Yeah, that's right. And another parallel just occurred to me, and we talked about this several times now, is I think it's Colossians, who being in the very form of God didn't think equality with God was something to be grasped.
Yeah. It's funny. I had that written down. It's Philippians 2.
Okay, yeah.
I had that. I knew I had a verse written down, and I was trying to find it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so he descends to become human, and then he descends further to become a servant, right? And
Yeah.
so he does all this in order to lift mankind up, right? And redeem man. Well, you see the same pattern in Thrushbeard, right? Because Thrushbeard is actually the king's son, but Thrushbeard is willing to take on the form of a beggar, right? Of a fiddler, to live in a stinking hovel, which he probably had to tolerate. I think there's even a point in the story where he's like, we don't have to live in this stinking hovel anymore, right?
Right.
We can go back to the palace.
I was just
right.
messing
So
with
it's
you
the
there.
same picture, though. It's the king's son, the son of God,
Right.
descending to become the lowest in order to redeem this person.
Right. Yeah,
It's a
descending
beautiful
into her
picture,
world.
but it's all there.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so clear. And you're right. So I would encourage the listener to go back and read it when you have time and think about it through that lens, because there's so many times, well, that's why I kept bursting out. Here's the gospel. Here's the gospel. You know what I mean? I couldn't contain myself because it's so obvious once you see it through that lens that a lot of the details take on a much deeper meaning. And, it's like the selling being on the corner. It's like, well, what does that matter? Man, now you really have a deeper understanding of that aspect. You have a deeper understanding of why it was a fiddler and not just a mere beggar. It was like, again, if this is Christ, an image of Christ, it's not just a mere beggar. It's somebody who understands the rhythm and the reality of the world. And I don't know, it's just a perfect picture that you can see all these little details from, but you got to go back and read it through that lens once again. And like we said, we've read it, 5, 6, 7, 10 times.
Yeah, several times. And it's another one where every time I read it, something new jumped out at me. But about the second time I read this and I got the connection to this is a story of God redeeming us, I was like, we've got to do this one. We've got to walk.
Oh,
this
yeah.
one. And
Yep.
great,
Absolutely.
Great fairy tale.
Well, it's a good ending one because, like you said, this is actually not a fairy tale type of fairy tale. It's more of a parable, but it's such a good one. It really kind of requires the understanding of other fairy tales to build on how to break this down, the symbolism, and get something out of it. But yeah, I hate we're at the end of it. We're going to have to do this series again in another season or something like that. This is too much fun for me.
Yeah, me too. We've talked about doing some different things. It might be something where we do ancient stories next season, but we maybe do a little bit different take. Maybe the parables of Jesus or maybe some of the Greek myths. But yeah, we'll figure out a way to keep working this in because I could go through, there's 200 Grimm's fairy tales. I could go through every one of them and have this conversation. But
oh, yeah, no kidding. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard from someone who's listened to one of the previous episodes that if we've ended up having this conversation about, man, I can't help but read any story, read into it now. I mean, it's just like you have a framework for understanding the deeper understanding symbolism in all stories, whether it's the Bible, whether it's mythology, whether it's a Marvel movie, right? You can just see it. Once you kind of grasp it and it's there, then you can kind of grab it in all kinds of different stories. So this whole series has been wonderfully helpful to me, and it's really changed the way I read the Bible and understand story in general. But like I said, I hate that it's over, but I guess we got to end at some point.
that's right.
We can't do this for 10 years.
Well, we could. We might be the only ones listening, but
Yeah, exactly.
all right. So this ends our Ancient Stories series for this season, at least. One programming note, if you listen to us as we release these, and we release these on the 1st and the 15th of each month, but if you're waiting with bated breath, waiting for the next release,
Right.
in July, we won't be doing any. Give ourselves a break. Got some vacations coming up. So we will pick back up sometime in August. We'll shoot for August 1st. And a little bit of teaser, we're going to look at the book of Ephesians, which should be fun because you and I have both been to Ephesus. And so we're going to bring some of those insights to that conversation.
All right. You wrote a book on it, so read up.
I wrote the book.
There's your homework.
I won't say the book on it. I won't say the book.
You wrote
but
Ephesians? How about that?
I wrote a book, yeah. I'm sure I'll find ways to plug that book. But
Surely. Right.
But yeah, there you go. That's the plan. And yeah, we'll see everyone in August.
Yeah. And go to our Facebook, go to our webpage, navigatingtheancientfaith.com, and we will see you after the break.